I'm going to start with our first speaker, Mike Sell. Apologies for using my phone for notes, because that's where we are today. Mike Sell is a professor of English at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He is a co-author with Michael Chemers of Systematic Dramaturgy, a Handbook for the Digital Age, and co-editor with Megan Amber Condis, of Ready Reader 1, The Stories We Tell with, around, and about video games. Please welcome Mike Sell.
I do not have a tiny URL. And one of my jokes that will happen about halfway through the talk was entirely dependent on the slideshow. So when I get there, I'll let you know, because it's going to be hilarious. It's going to kill. I'm going to start a timer for myself. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. So my talk is called Playing the Monster, or Monster Studies from Inside the Mask. In one of the more striking moments in horror cinema, the 1931 film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and it's pronounced Dr. Jekyll in that version, begins in the first-person point of view, and the slide for this was stunning. You know what? It was video. It was a really nicely edited video clip. It was really just so. It begins in the first-person point of view of Dr. Jekyll himself. It is at once utterly disorienting and great fun, allowing us to imagine ourselves into the perspective of the dashing and talented scientist before the film shifts into the conventional third-person point of view. A similar, and maybe more infamous moment happens in John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween, though the disorientation that the first-person POV provides, where we are inside a Halloween mask at one point, looking through the eye holes, is disconcerting and disturbing, implicating us less in the character of Michael Myers than in the meaningless madness that he will wreak on Haddonfield. The shift into third person is a moment of relief in this case, a return to the comfort of the cinematic third person and the perspective of medical and criminological authorities. Okay. So here's my pitch. I would argue that the field of monster studies is organized almost entirely on one side of this cinematic cut from first person to third person. On the one side of this ontological and perceptual edit, the point of view of the monster. On the other side of the edit, the witness, the authorities, yes, the victims of the monster. Okay, I need to frame this a little carefully. So I'm going to be talking about first-person monstrosity. I personally have no interest in leveraging this study towards understanding the psychology of monsters. I'm not interested in leveraging this towards Mr. Hyde, Michael Myers, abusers, transphobes, and Nazis. So I want to frame that very carefully, right? It's just not interesting to me. I don't think there's any value to it, frankly. And all respect to Rob Zombie and his remake of the Halloween films, which invite us to think about that perspective. I am interested in how a shift in point of view enables us to better understand the craft, process, and experience of becoming and being a make-believe monster. Instead of the third-person perspective of the spectator, the critic, and the theorist, the first-person perspective focuses on the actor, the camera operator, the lighting designer, the crafter of masks. As a kind of footnote here, I'm in the field of English studies, and we're engaging broadly in an idea of post-critique and thinking about shifting our perspectives towards a more autoethnographic, autotheoretical, first-person understanding of what reading and watching and criticism is. So it's aligned in that respect. There's a pervasive, the joke is coming real quick, it's coming up. There's a pervasive bias in our field towards the third person. This one-sided focus is evident in the foundational works of monster theory. In fact, in many of our papers that are being presented, most of the papers that are being presented here, including Michael Chemers' The Monster in Theater History, This Thing of Darkness. On the one hand, and as one would expect, Michael is meticulously attentive to the cultural, symbolic, semiotic, literary, and theater historical dimensions of the theatrical monster. And as one would expect, he is indefatigably and dedicatedly attentive to the function of the performer in the enactment of monstrosity. On the other hand, he does not speak to the specific experiences of actors as they become the monster. I checked in with him just to be sure. It'd been a while since I'd read it. I did a quick scan. I was like, Michael, did I do it? And he's saying, no, I didn't do that. Okay. he didn't talk about how actors, performers read scripts, identify their choices, articulate their connections to monstrous desire and form. How they develop their makeup and costume, how they practice their transformations, manage the butterflies, and thrill to the experience of thrilling their audiences. The monster is generally and mostly the monster that we buy a ticket to see, rather than a being that we might embody, and in so doing, find pleasure, fun, and the possibility of self-transformation. Here's where the joke would have come in. So I would have just like hit a pause for about 5 seconds, and then I would have switched to the next slide. And the slide reads, when criticizing the work of a recognized authority on a subject, make sure to do so while they're presenting on a panel scheduled concurrently with your own. Right? Am I right? Wasn't that great? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much. I told you it was good. Yeah? All right. Thank you, guys. You're very, very kind. So to my question and provocation, what might we learn about monsters and monstrosity if we shifted our perspective from the third person to the first person? What if the monster historian and monster theorist moved from the auditorium to the makeup room? I had a picture of Boris Karloff in his classic Frankenstein, and it's a color picture, so he's green and he's sticking his tongue out at us. So it's just one of these really charming pictures. Or I'm making this up just to get your affection. What if we moved to the sidewalks alongside trick-or-treaters, to the prep room of haunted houses and hayrides, or to the tabletop where players take on the role of adventurers delving into dungeons, or play messy teenage monsters, or pretend to be characters in a Monster of the Week television series? I think we can learn quite a bit. During my time today, I want to explore a very thin slice of playing the monster and a narrow, but I hope fruitful understanding of the possibilities of what I would call first-person monster scholarship. And that focus will be the tabletop role-playing game and two kind of conceptual frameworks for thinking about playing the monster in TTRPGs. Does anyone need a quick definition of tabletop role-playing games? I had a slide that had like a quick definition. Tabletop role-playing games, have you heard of Dungeons and Dragons? Okay, so tabletop role-playing games generally involve a group of people sitting around a table, typically with dice, and collaboratively they tell a story according to particular rules. Tabletop role-playing games come in a variety of genres, from adventurers going into lugubrious dungeons to clear out the monsters. I'll talk about that more. Messy, you could pretend that you're all messy teenage monsters at a high school. Last night, a group of us were playing what's called Monster of the Week, and we play sort of like a weekly episodic television show that features monster hunters, and they come in various guises and roles. I almost want to gesture over to Elizabeth Swensen. How'd I do? I should be gesturing over to you. How did I do? Does that help a little bit? Okay, thanks. How'd I do?
I think you did very well. Okay. I think the act of pretending to be someone you aren't, following along sometimes very complicated, but sometimes very simple rules, and sometimes led by a storyteller, someone whose job it is to guide the narrative. It's a common feature, but not always a feature.
Yeah, and I'll talk about that. Yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you. So towards that end, I'm going to quickly sketch two conceptual frameworks, doing so in anticipation of a more extensive and detailed exploration at a future date. I'm leaving a lot out today. That includes the culture surrounding TTRPGs, that will be the abbreviation, TTRPGs, and the practices that occur around specific gaming groups. This is really important. The culture of the table matters, and that's not really going to be part of my conversation at all. I'm not going to be providing full credit to the many other scholars and creators who are exploring first-person monstrosity, including my co-panelist, Samantha Gorman, who will be talking about the psychology of Vecna, one of the great monsters in Dungeons & Dragons lore. And I should also mention the actors who performed Monster at Wednesday night's staged reading. That's first-person monstrous play. So I want you to consider this invitation as an invitation to question, consolidate, criticize, and play. Tabletop role-playing games are fantastic. They're really super fun. I hope you get a chance to play, right? They're really great. They're one of my favorite things. All right, so two conceptual frameworks. One, the verbal, visual, and narrative representation of monsters in TTRPG texts, rule books, and so on. And secondly, the rules of monstrous play. Okay, so the monster was present at the invention of the tabletop role-playing game. It's right there in the name, Dungeons & Dragons. In the 82 pages of the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, published in 1974, the word monster or monsters appears 82 times. I'm sorry, my bad, 203 times. The fun of D&D is the fun of playing with monsters, but it's mostly about the fun of killing monsters. Further, D&D segregated the first-person perspective entirely towards one person, the so-called dungeon master, the game manager, who is the primary storyteller, who has the whole world in their head and in their notebooks, and is also functioning as the referee. But in the initial iterations of D&D, there was one exception to the idea that players, besides the game manager, didn't play as monsters, and it was this figure called the half-orc. I'm going to just kind of touch on this because a lot of the information was embedded in the slides, and it was meant to be read in real time, and it'll take up a lot of time to talk it through. The point being that the presence of the half-orc indicates that even in the earliest iterations of D&D in which monstrous play was really centered on the DM, they had the most fun being the monster, and it's great fun. That there was some interest in letting everyone play as a monster, at least with a little flavor. That flavor was racist. The half-orc adventure was a quote-unquote mongrel whose abilities, and this is described in the rules, placed it in the top 10% of its fellow mongrels, and whose essential ugliness and unpleasantness was represented by a penalty to certain kinds of dice rolls involving personality. And they were essentially a figure of hatred. If someone else at the table was playing a dwarf or an elf, you're supposed to hate the half-orc, and the half-orc's supposed to hate you. And that's got to inform your play. Now, this is where a slide is. This has really changed, and it's been driven primarily by player culture. And right now, I want to say that there are something like probably 3 dozen different playable beings who we would consider to be forms of monsters, which would be either centaurs or bird people or orcs or goblins and so on and so forth. There's a loxodon, which is kind of like an elephant guy. He's gigantic, and he's got a big elephant head, and he's got the big elephant feet and hands and so on. This is also was a really charming slide. I was also going to note the half-orc is something of a thirst trap these days, so if you get online, you look up half-orc, there are a lot of sexy half-orcs out there. And that's been driven in part by Critical Role. Who's the guy who plays in the first season?
Travis Willingham.
Yeah, remember his character? Yeah, so this very sexy actor played a half-orc, and so you're like, okay, yeah, this is what half-orcs are now. Okay, so conclusion of this first framing of the idea of the verbal and visual representation of monsters in TTRPGs is that the evolution, ramification, and decentralizing of first-person monstrous play in TTRPGs is kind of interesting, and I think it's worth more consideration. Second, the rules of monstrous plays. In tabletop role-playing games, we play the monsters by the rules. This is significant not only to our understanding of TTRPGs, but of monstrosity and monsters more generally. In his book, Player vs. Monster, Jaroslav Zvelch argues that the gamification of monsters in TTRPGs and video games represents not just the transposition of monster-centered narratives into another storytelling medium, but a shift in monstrous representation more broadly. There would have been a quote that would, I have a fairly long quote here, and I apologize for front-loading all this information. He characterizes the monsters that we see in films, novels, folktales, nightmares, and popular culture as sublime. They exceed our perceptions. They terrify and frighten us. They are figures of cosmic horror. They baffle language. They make us feel things that we don't feel. They force us to run in repulsion or terror. They're sublime, in contrast to the contained monster. He writes, there is a paradox common to many monster narratives, both in video games and other media. There is a mysterious monster we're supposed to fear, and a hero who, using strength, skill, and wits, defeats the monster. But if we know that the monster can be defeated, can it still be fearsome? If we know its name and its weak spots, is it still mysterious? Frankly, yes, all right? But that's beside the point. Traditionally and generally, the gamified monster in TTRPGs and video games is a monster designed to be known, and through that knowing, defeated, yes. But this kind of monstrosity sits uneasily among Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's 7 theses. In games, the monstrum, the showing forth at the heart of the monster, kind of shows us not the deeply embedded conceptual, affective, and ideological contradictions of culture. Mostly, the gamified monster is a quantum. Statistics, abilities, rewards. In this respect, the monster is stabilized and often commodified. Okay, now, I was going to show a slide with a bunch of games that kind of fit in this category: Dungeons & Dragons, Call of Cthulhu, which is a Lovecraftian game, Monster of the Week, as well as games like Mothership and Dread that Elizabeth introduced me to recently. So this quantified, commodified monster is certainly true of games like D&D, Call of Cthulhu, and so on, but there are innumerable games in which the rules of monstrous play neither reduce the monster to a contained quantum, but amplify and complicate the very idea of knowing monstrosity. Again, the reminder, my question and provocation: can a shift in how we perceive, experience, and analyze the figure of the monster help us to both better understand monstrosity, but also enable us to deploy that understanding towards new kinds of critical, pedagogical, creative, and personal knowing and making, what Maddie Bryce calls prototyping the self? At this point, I would put a slide up that has several games, some a little bit older, some much more recent. Vampire the Masquerade, Monster Hearts, messy teenagers. Our Haunt. I'll be guesting on the Dungeons and Drama Nerds podcast. They're currently playing Our Haunt. We're going to be talking about intertextual reference in TTRPGs. A game like Monsters and Other Childish Things. The Skeletons, the 1,000-year-old vampire. These are all TTRPGs in very different formats and play styles, some of them solo journaling games that leverage first-person monstrosity towards diverse forms of storytelling, reflection, improvisation, experimentation, community creation, and fun. These games provide opportunities, to quote Maddie Bryce again, to prototype the self and to sustain that prototyping through dramatic storytelling and improvisational, collaborative imagination. They are opportunities, to recall Deanna Daniel's presentation yesterday, which was great, to play in a way that pleasurably destabilizes how we perceive, feel, and interact with the monster. To play the monstrous in a way that challenges the conventional relationship between the figure of the monster, the ghost, the witch, the demon, and the affective and symbolic charge of monstrosity conventionally associated with that monster. So I'm borrowing heavily from Daniel's idea of the monstrous, monstrosity, and monster. Vampire the Masquerade, for example, was created by Mark Rain Hagen precisely because playing as vampires is at least as interesting as hunting them. It's more interesting. Okay. It was more interesting. Sorry for the stage whisper there. This shift in the distribution of monstrous play enables players of the game to explore not only the specific monstrosity of vampirism, but also the kinds of plots, narrative intrigues, interpersonal conflicts, and desires that one associates with kind of contemporary urban-based Gothic narrative. Similarly, in the case of Avery Alder's Monster Hearts, we play and know monstrosity not by hunting or by commodifying it, but by pretending to be messy teenage monsters in a high school horror show. Monster Hearts takes the tropes of monstrosity, violence, desire, manipulation, power, and queers them. The various skins one plays are the ones we expect and love from monster narratives. There's the ghost, the werewolf, the ghoul, the witch. There's also some interesting monstrified queer tropes, like the queen and the serpentine. These allegorical representations of queer teenage subjectivity, Alder tells us, quote, push back against the heterosexist framework that underlies so many of our culture's stories. When you play, you contend with all the chaotic possibility and uncertainty of desire. And this is where I'm going to conclude. Or better said, what I hope would be where we might begin, certainly where I'm going to begin. As I mentioned, the two conceptual frameworks here, the representational and the ludic, are only two of many ways of engaging the perspectives of players at the table and the way they customize and improvise monstrosity to comport with their tastes and sensitivities. I had a misprision there. One of the key things to think about is what people do at the table, right? And the way that monstrosity and monster and the kinds of actions and sensibilities, players at the table and players in the culture are constantly revising and rethinking and pushing back against designers and corporations that insist on racist, queerphobic, etc. Representations of monsters and monstrosity. I have not considered the perspectives of the makers of games, whether TTRPGs or video games, though I suspect one of the panelists will help us to think a little bit about that. I've also not considered in detail the histories of specific games and their many versions, nor how those versions articulate changing understandings and ludonarrative designs of monsters and monstrosity. I've not considered the histories of specific publishers or designers and the games they make. You get any idea? There's a lot for us to consider. There's a lot that are being considered by other scholars. And of course, I have not considered the broader environment of first-person monstrosity, which requires us to talk to those who play the monster or think about ourselves when we play the monster. We need to search the archives for traces of their voices and the tricks of the monstrous trade. And I haven't considered the practices of play, the kinds of playful prototyping, Maddie Bryce once more, of monstrosity that always happens when a group of people get together to play with the monster, or better yet, as the monster. Regardless, I hope this brief and completely incomplete exploration of the tabletop role-playing game and the larger framework of first-person monster play has demonstrated to you the possibilities and pleasures of a playful shift in our perspectives on monstrosity. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Next, we have Kristopher Funk. Kristopher Funk is a mixed media installation artist from the East Bay. Funk creates puzzle-based experiences by synthesizing sculptural, interactive, and spatial practices to critique topics of identity and disability. He has a BA in comparative media studies and game design and an MFA from digital arts and new media. Thank you so much, Chris. And is one of these tiny URLs yours, at the bottom one?
Yes, yeah. And Elliot and I are presenting together. So.
Oh, wonderful. So I will read Elliot's bio as well. Elliot White, they, them, is an artist from Los Angeles. They create experimental narrative games, strange costumes, and fleshy sculptures. Heavily influenced by science fiction and gothic horror, their work explores neurodivergent trans life. They hold an MFA from the University of California, Santa Cruz in digital arts and new media. Please welcome Chris and Elliot.
Slides. I have a very small version for you on my iPad, but also if you want to pull them up, it's tinyurl.com/M Monsterfest. Because we are talking about games that we made, some of our slides are important, or you're going to be a little bit confused on what we are saying. Yeah, and you won't get our really good also visual joke that we put in there. That is going to be interesting to explain out loud. Yeah, are we ready?
I believe so.
Okay, cool. Yeah, hopefully that URL works. And if it doesn't, someone let me know now.
Let me know, are we blocking the URL currently?
Totally.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, it's just tinyurl.com/M Monsterfest. Hopefully, if I did it correctly. Yeah, ready. Okay, yeah, as Elizabeth said, I am Kristopher Funk.
And I am Elliot White.
And this is our presentation, Monstrous Game Environments, Dystopic Presence, and Speculative Futures in the Medical Industrial Complex.
We'll be discussing the two games that we designed this past year, how they interact with one another, and how they facilitate conversations through a monstrous lens. Ooh, and now we get to do
I know, isn't this going to be
double
really fun?
slide progression.
Okay, so my game is called Facades of Ingress, and it is an interactive puzzle-based experience revealing the monster that lies at the center of the institution. Players work together to solve tedious, obtuse puzzles in an attempt to appease the monster and gain what they need.
And my piece, I guess we're going to do a lot of leaning. My piece is a visual novel called A Night for Flesh and Roses. It is a video game and mixed media installation that explores possible bodies of the future and self-expression through sci-fi body horror surgery. Players mash together body parts and subvert what human bodies are expected to look like.
So we both decided to make games, obviously, instead of a different form of media, because we think that they provide a level of interactivity, performance, and choice that is different and unique compared to other forms of media.
For example, games allow for an embodied experience, so players are able to enter different frames of reference, allowing them to think about situations and ideas in ways they might not have considered before or personally reflect their lived experience.
Games also require a degree of agency or lack of agency that is different from other forms of media. They need a degree of player input, so there's an extra level of interactivity and immersion that comes from a player believing, rightly or wrongly so, that they have a level of control over the game environment.
Additionally, while a player is actively participating, they can be more easily immersed in different worlds, not just as spectators, but as actors.
And games have a unique way of communicating ideas. So when players, I'm so sorry, I just forgot what I was saying. Yes, games are a unique form of communicating ideas because the ways in which players communicate and connect with each other through the games is much different than how people can communicate in different forms of media.
Games facilitate alternative communities. So games have the ability to reach a wide audience, both through digital distribution and through instructional or algorithmic type models. Communities provide space for player discussion and creation of their own work rather than only consuming. So in this way, games allow you to be a part of a shared space that is actively curated by those involved.
Games also can be multiplayer or single player, so they have the ability to isolate a player, allowing them to have unique solo experiences, or provide space for communication and collaboration.
Both of our work, the reason why we're here, both of us chose themes of monsters in our games. The monster is a very helpful tool to explore in our art for various reasons as well. Some of the main themes that we touch on in our pieces are deviancy, control, and societal expectations.
Yeah, so one of the things, I mean, these are all things that you all know. We've all read Cohen, but like multiple people over the course of referenced him, so it's really funny. But basically, monsters cross categories. So they cross like social categories, refusing to exist inside specific boxes.
The monster also destabilizes a considered order of society. So when a monster refuses to exist as one thing or another, it destabilizes the pre-established order of a culture. This might be an outside-in destabilization, such as a fear of an other coming into the society and disrupting normalcy, or it could be inside-out, an individual raised in that society, but for whatever reason is unable to adopt that normal culture and cannot exist or fit into that existing structure.
There's also the idea of the defect. Monsters are seen as defective, something that needs to be cured, destroyed, or hidden to keep societal order.
In response to this fear that is created about the monster because it needs to be controlled, this also facilitates a fear in many people of becoming said monster. So if you are considering, you will... Let me restart this sentence. I am so sorry, everybody. In response to needing to keep an ordered, normal society of control, it breeds a fear for the otherized monster. People can become afraid of becoming the thing that is stigmatized most because it means that they would then become a target of that stigma. This fear causes many to deny or reject parts of themselves, so I also calling it closeted monsters in different ways.
Okay, so now we're going to go on and talk a little bit about our individual games and why we are presenting them together. So Facades of Ingress and A Night for Flesh and Roses explore how trans and disabled folks exist inside the medical industrial complex and how they are treated by society. They use very different methodology to do so, however, while Facades of Ingress focuses on current dystopian ways that the medical industrial complex exists in the present, A Night for Flesh and Roses looks at a speculative future beyond our current medical system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Facades of Ingress now, in which I pose not the disabled folks as the monster, but the medical industrial complex as the true monster, which some of you might know as the social model of disability studies. So Facades of Ingress flips the script on usual relics of disabled folks. Oh, I just kind of said that. Gonna skip that line. Apologies. Yeah, it isn't disabled folks who are the monster for destabilizing societal norms, but the society that enforces those norms. So in the game, players must appease the monster through gameplay in order to gain accommodations. However, the monster, aka the medical industrial complex, does not make it easy, and all of the puzzles are specifically designed to be really difficult and frustrating. So next slide. Yeah, most of the next slides are just some pictures of my installation, which y'all can also see both of our stuff later, which is in 306, which is the room right there. But yeah, so the creation of the monster is based on my personal experiences and frustrations. So in the photos that you may see, and when you see it later, you may notice that there's a strong focus on medication. That is because during the creation of Facades of Ingress, I was struggling to gain the medication that I needed in order to function. However, disability is a huge spectrum, and where I struggle with the monster, and even I struggle in so many different ways with the monster than just medication, but is so different from how other folks struggle with it. Obviously, disability, ableism, and the wonders of the medical industrial complex are not one size fits all. Oops, what am I doing? There we go. Okay. I am going to give a warning right here. I'm going to be talking a lot about ableism, and I'm going to be honest, my part of this presentation could be a little upsetting. Also, big spoilers, because unfortunately I cannot talk about why I made Facades of Ingress without completely spoiling the game for you. So if you haven't played it and you want to go in with a fresh experience, I'm so sorry. Please plug your ears and hum your favorite spooky tune for the next 5 minutes. So before players play the game, they are given a random number of golden spoons. If you don't know what spoon theory is, it is basically the theory that all of us begin the day with a certain number of spoons. Each task that we do takes a different number of spoons depending on the person and depending on the day. And so it's kind of, this is like a video game panel. So if you think about it as like your health bar or your energy bar, it's going to take different amounts of energy to do things for each person. In disability studies, we call it spoon theory. So players begin by getting a random number of golden spoons. While playing, a spoon can be given to the game master in exchange for help with a puzzle, the answer to a question, or a hint of how to proceed. Basically, any interaction the player wants to have with the game master must be preceded by them giving the game master a spoon. If players run out of spoons, then the game master will no longer provide help and completely ignore the player. However, through 2 flesh windows that you can see into A Night for Flesh and Roses, players can ask folks not playing the game on the other side of the installation for more spoons that are hidden around the installation. So there's a sign next to the flesh windows that reads, "Out of spoons? That sucks. Maybe your community can help you out. Please reach across the void and ask." So there are 3 main puzzles that make up this game. The first one is a 3D jigsaw heart puzzle that players have to physically put together and put in the monster's chest. The medical industrial complex and most capitalist systems are twofold. So disabled folks need the monster in order to function in society that wasn't made for them, but also the monster needs us, because without us, the help that the monster gives would become obsolete, therefore the monster would be obsolete. So it needs us to need it in order to keep its power and control over us as much as we need it to function in an ableist society. Players then move on to what I'm calling the Simon Says crystal puzzle. If you've ever played like the classic Simon Says game with the 4 glowing buttons, it's kind of like that. So there are 4 buttons on the back of the monster that correspond to different crystal clusters on the monster's back. These crystal clusters will glow and make a twinkle sound, and players must push the buttons to match the order of the crystals. It gets increasingly harder every round, starting with 1 crystal and going up to 5 crystals that the players must remember and push the buttons in the correct order in order to move on. If at any point in the game they get a crystal wrong, then the whole Simon Says game starts over. There is a little secret, though, and this is the secret with most of the game. The puzzle is broken. It does not function properly. So sometimes, even when players push the correct sequence, the game will still fail you and make you start over. Sometimes, before you even push any buttons, the game will fail you and make you start over. The next thing that players have to do once they complete the Crystal Simon Says puzzle is the final step of the game. Hooray, they're almost done, they're almost free. They must feed the monster the correct prescription slip. However, there are 6 prescription slips that players are provided with, all for which medication I have either been on or am currently on that have either ranged from very helpful for my health to very detrimental for my health. The thing is, players do not get any help or hints or clues on what the correct prescription slip is. They have 3 attempts to feed it to the monster. If they can't get it right in those 3 attempts, then the monster gets really mad. It actually throws the heart jigsaw puzzle out of its chest, shattering it on the floor and starting the game all over again. So players once again have to rebuild the heart, put it in its chest, do the Simon Says Crystal puzzle, and try the prescription puzzle again. And here's where people get really mad at me because, and also this is the biggest spoiler of the game, so if you really don't want this, plug your ears. So this game has no end. It is impossible to fully appease the monster. No matter what prescription slip you feed into its mouth, it is always going to reject it and throw its heart out of its chest, keeping you trapped in its loop. Because trying to get accommodations in the wondrous medical industrial complex is a never-ending cycle.
And then we switch over.
Perfect.
We switch over from that bummer. No, I'm just kidding. It's very well designed and it's great, and I highly recommend people check it out, but it is a bummer. So let's go into the speculative future. So my piece, A Night for Flesh and Roses, in contrast, I'm imagining the transgender body or the body in general as a desirable monster. So I'm rejecting the traditional notion of a monstrous abnormal body and instead accepting it, embracing it, as it fights against these medical and societal norms. So in my game, the player is not forced into boxes that are typically associated with trans medical care. Outside of a nod to the stifling bureaucratic procedures of dealing with insurance authorization and diagnosis in the introduction to the game allows the player to follow their whims freely outside of body norms. By removing the boundaries of what the body can be, my work throws off the constraints placed upon the transgender body in the medical industrial complex. Mechanically, this is done through a horror version of a traditional drag and drop dress-up game. If you've seen those before, a lot of them are web and browser-based. Instead of picking out cute clothes to put on typically female dolls, the player collages cutouts from the Grey's Anatomy text to create their own kind of horrific collage amalgamations of human body parts. It doesn't have any default starting point like how many typical video game character creators do. So in this way, players are given a blank slate and have to make with it what they will rather than trying to alter a preconceived notion of the human body. The player can also change what they look like at any point during the game, allowing for more flexibility, mirroring the often nonlinear journeys of many trans people. The player gets to be part of a small outsider community focused on bodily autonomy and unconventional desires. This turns the typical transphobic narrative of the mutilated medical and sexual deviant on its head, allowing for a community to form of those who would be seen by the medical industry and the outside world as too strange. Good enough. In the game, characters subvert typical displays of intimacy, as seen with the character on the left saying, "Now it's good that I'm narrating this," because the text is really small. So the character on this slide, there's a character on the left that's talking to the player, and if you've chosen pieces that the character you're talking to does find attractive. For instance, if you choose a heart to be a part of your kind of collage, it says, "Would you let me slide my fingers across the muscular walls of your heart?" So just as going beneath clothes is a form of intimate connection, in this world, beings peel back even more layers to reveal forbidden parts of the body. I also tried to play with traditional conventions of romantic visual novel video games. So on the right, there's a character that's saying, and I'll read their dialogue out loud, they're saying, "You're clearly pandering to me," which is pretty pathetic of you, to be honest. So this happens when the character notes that you don't have a lot of muscular body parts, and you decide to change that mid-conversation. So in this way, I am calling out the player for trying to min-max or otherwise gain more traction points with a specific character. So the installation that I created around my game has an analog version of the digital collage character creator present in the game. This allows players more choice, creativity, and flexibility, and it's also more welcoming to people that are less familiar with video games. There's an image of two people crafting a creature on the table, which you can also do today if you would like to. There is a message on the table that reads, "Imagine you have entered a realm where bodies are no longer bound to the confines of medical taxonomies and physics, inventing a new form of biology." Each piece was illustrated by English anatomist Henry Van Dyke Carter in the mid-1800s while referencing human cadavers, but you will give them new life. Create a character, your body, or something else out of the pieces provided, and take one of the hexagonal felt plates to use as your canvas. To keep the pieces in place, use the sewing pins in the middle of the table. Be careful they're sharp. Don't get too carried away and jab the pins through to the other side. People still did this, though. Once you're done, you can either take your creation home with you, or if that isn't your idea of tasteful decor, you can hang it on one of the hooks in the room suspended by red yarn. In this way, the installation gained more and more people's creations as the exhibit went on. Designing a public environment to facilitate a single-player game experience was a challenge. I wanted players to feel like they had some level of privacy and intimacy, but people still had to come and go. So I created these small cave-like pockets where the computers are set up so people could nestle themselves away. And you can see some images of that in the slide of people playing. The entrance also featured the character creator on its own. This way, participants were introduced to the major themes of the game without needing to dedicate their time to a longer narrative experience. Here are my beautiful flesh mice. I don't have too much time, but just know that I'm very inspired by David Cronenberg, and I wanted the plasticky, sterile interface of the computer to feel more alive. These are just a couple images, so I'll scroll past those for now. And now we'll talk about the interaction between our two pieces. And Chris, slide over.
Yeah, so the main point of interaction between our two pieces is a wall separating them with what we call flesh portals in it. You can see different images on the slides or go see it yourself next door. But while the wall of the installation was a barrier that separates and isolates the two experiences, the permeability of the wall through the flesh portals provides a look at how the communities overlap and impact each other. The flesh portals also create a space for sharing resources and community collaboration, for how they have to swap spoons back and forth when people run out in Facades of Ingress. We chose to make the portals between the two worlds fleshy as an allegory for the way in which the medical system passes through the body. Both disabled and trans folks often have to share intimate details about their bodies with not only friends, family, and their community, but also with medical professionals, strangers, employers, and society as a whole. The fleshiness also provided a sometimes unpleasant, sometimes pleasant, depends what you're into, sensation that you literally have to pass your hand through the flesh in order to exchange the spoons. This mirrors how in society, reaching out and asking for help often comes with many psychological and physical barriers. Players also must communicate through the flesh portal without any shared base of knowledge. So those inside Facades of Ingress do not have any knowledge of what folks inside A Night for Flesh and Roses are doing, and vice versa. Many times when players in Facades of Ingress were like, "Hey, are there any spoons over there?" they were met with confusion because people inside A Night for Flesh and Roses had no idea what the spoons were for. So this facilitates a conversation between folks in both exhibits, similar to the social dynamics of asking for and explaining accommodations and situations about disability and transness with strangers, especially when there is a lack of public and societal knowledge about their existence.
and I'll go quick on this one, but one of the other things that made the interactions between the two interesting was that the exhibits put players into different emotional states. For Flesh and Roses didn't have any time constraints. It was about creativity and meandering, so the constraints of creating a horrifying monster body with these various cutouts was more liberating compared to Facades of Ingress, where while trapped in this cycle, players were met with frustration and needing to follow an exact procedure. So between these two, we kind of embodied the emotional states of being in this frustrating, painful present versus the joy and fulfillment of reaching a possible future.
Yeah, sorry, we're like over time, we know. We're literally about done. So basically, in conclusion, we're tired, and both of us made these games not only for our graduate thesis, in which Elizabeth Swensen was committee members for both of us, but we made these games because we were both at times in transness and disability when things seemed hopeless and isolating. And here's our visual joke. It's the monster's butt. But
it's not as good when it's small.
Yeah, it would have been really, guys, it would have been really funny, we swear.
Through the process of creating these works, we've seen how much they resonate with a wide audience. Folks who have gone through similar experiences, both positive and negative, are able to feel a level of catharsis and connection through both works. Both games sparked great conversations with players and got many thinking more deeply about systems they might not have realized actually personally impact them. We hope to continue to make art that inspires more community conversation and allows us to have fun in the process. Thank you.
Sorry, we went over it.
It's all right. The fact that you are a combined presentation makes this all possible. I will say those two projects are viewable after the coffee break. They both do require power, but Chris can run you through. Wow, we have power. Oh, goodness gracious, that's amazing. Okay, let me introduce the last speaker of this panel. We have so many wonderful visual slides that you can see with the tiny URL for Gorman's talk there, tinyurl.com/SGVECNA or VECNA related to this talk. Samantha Gorman is a writer, director, and co-lead of Studio Tenderclaws. She specializes in virtual performance and writing across media, games, AI, and VR. Her writing is solicited by partners like Google, Netflix, and Meta to showcase how emerging platforms can deliver innovative narrative. Gorman is faculty in the Computational Media Department at the University of California here at Santa Cruz.
Cool, thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk, I'm going to make this kind of brief. You'll be able to see some of it in the slides. I'm sorry that I can't show you the visual references. The thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is the behind the scenes of trying to get inside the mind of what is a monster in order to write backstory for Vecna for Stranger Things VR. And I'll show you some of the long process and some of the scripts, which you can see on your phone. You won't be able to see the text here, but it's very much taking you through the inner process of the writing. Yes. Do you need me to speak louder? Just stay in front of the microphone. Got it. Cool. Okay. So for some context for why I was able to do this wacky thing. I'm coming from a background in writing, and as Elizabeth introduced me, so I'm going to actually skip through this slide. But I ended up in the games world when my interactive cinema and digital novels were, they were kind of a confusing fit in the writing world, a confusing fit in the film world. So actually the games world is what kind of embraced and made this type of work and this type of writing possible. And it's because I think games have a really natural affinity for understanding interactivity. So yeah, we've released 6 long-form experiences over the last 8 years. Our studio is in between 6 and 30 people, depending on what we're working on. I also work with arts organizations as well as some of the R&D that become creative narrative projects that are out in the world, like this game. Okay. So we'll see how this goes. You can also see it online. Who's seen the show Stranger Things? Okay, cool. So hopefully you guys can see that. If you can't, it's online or in the slides. So in order to talk about like the process of like getting inside like what it meant to write for this character, I should probably do a very brief description of some of the things for Stranger Things because I had to live inside and really immerse myself in this IP for about like 3 years. So in summary, Stranger Things VR, our piece, is a character study of the main villain. It's a monster revealed in recent seasons that may have been lurking behind the scenes of the last 3 seasons. And this game was carefully made and coordinated to slot into the content and context of the show. Stranger Things itself as a show follows a group of kids in the 1980s who encounter supernatural forces and government experiments as they try to save the world along the way. It primarily focuses on Elle, a young girl who has telekinetic powers and a connection to the Upside Down, which is a dark parallel dimension filled with monsters. And this show did well for 3 seasons without the introduction of this character. And there's a sort of, I don't have 100% insight into the addition of him, but it's definitely a part in backwards design and backwards writing where you have to imagine him lurking along throughout the last numbers of episodes and what he's doing in the background. And that's very much like what I was trying to like live inside and model. So I was facing a blank page. I essentially had this crazy opportunity to write on anything I wanted in relation to the show. And with the development of the most recent season, is the prompt that was given was that it was going to dip into surreal dimensions of dreams and nightmares. And the newest addition would be a villain who would be paying homage to 80s monsters. So as I absorbed everything about the IP that had come out at this point, the question remained about what story needed to be told or could be told in this form that was probably like a little bit nuanced and complicated. And many of our projects deal with swapping perspectives or embodiment in other worlds and dimensions. So this was a natural fit for some of the themes that we were working with. The question was, could the story be told from many perspectives that were not seen in the show? And if so, who? And this was very much the time when season 4 scripts were still being written. So I was able to like have some insight into the development of this character and think about like how to dovetail with those scripts and kind of flesh it out in a sense that you actually had to like live it in this 6-hour game, but also, as we'll talk about later, like a little bit more complicated and nuanced for your embodiment of this monster. Yeah, okay, so the next part was about how it started from a joke of like what would happen if we actually like did the game from the perspective of a demo dog and some of the like hive mind and like the monsters inhabiting this Upside Down, and that became the actual real metaphor for what the writing became. So for those of you who, this did not, sorry about that. I did not catch that. Thanks for like all your patience, guys. This is like a really fun thing. Okay, so for those who play D&D, it's important that you'll probably recognize Vecna. Vecna is a villain that comes from D&D, which is a central game to the show. And it's not his birth name, in case you were curious, but it's a villain name that's used by the hero's kids to instead of his human name. And there's like much more to talk about for Vecna, actually, as how he was represented by D&D and what sort of elements were brought over into the show. But I'm not going to go too deep into that. I'm more or less giving a little bit of overview, and if there's time, I don't know if there'll be time for Q&A, but you're welcome to talk to me later about this process. So it's one thing to play against Vecna, but what if you're the monster, the POV of the monster, when you're playing as Vecna, that opens up a whole sort of range of complications and nuance. And how do you get an audience to inhabit that space without, and make this like character feel grounded and believable and powerful to play, but also multidimensional, and fight against the cartoonish nature of 80s villains in a way that's like both joy, but also both like making the character feel human without celebrating the evil. So there's a very like fine and like hard line to walk. So the way that I approached this project was, and this is, you're not going to be able to see it here, but it is on the slides. It's a behind the scenes analysis. And I focused on what would make Vecna feel inhabitable, what would feel like grounded and less cliche or less expected from this, this kind of like metaphor of the villain. And there wasn't a lot to draw on, so I used the absence of, there was an absence of like defining his monsterhood, so I had to define his monsterhood in relation to the others around him in some ways, and in relation to his relationships. And this was a relational chart showing where characters started, where I wanted them to end, and how they would get there. It required a close reading of the script in early development, and through that close reading, that is how I realized the repetition of the word monsters throughout the show Stranger Things and how it is explicitly used could probably be its own like scholarly paper, but it was really telling about the relations between its characters and how that formed what the identity of like a monster was in this case, and one of the main treatises of the show. So, yeah. The other thing was like I had to learn about the world. And in these early brainstorming notes, I think the most relevant thing is their characters are starting on both directions, both Elle and Vecna, from an embracing and a fear of monsterhood. And those are two like kind of bound up in each other, where they operate as sort of foils against each other. So by breaking those characters down and then thinking about, okay, well, I know I want them at the end to, what does it mean to like be complicit and understand or reject your power or embrace your power? And looking deeply into the show, what are the themes that dovetail with that? And one of the themes that identified was this process of outsiders. But the way that I got to outsiders was actually through the fact that Stranger Things is very much a love letter to a specific period in the 80s, orbiting around childhood friendship. And you know, there's also Lost Boys if you're in Santa Cruz. I just want to point that out because it's, you know, our movie. But they're also, the thing about that I noticed about these groups is also a collection of outsiders. So it's like, okay, well, if I'm looking into monsterhood and imagining what the monster is there an element of like outsider and like outsider as like a group, outsiders as a group linking together, and outsider as like the like individual like being alone? And how would that reflect the relationships and the desires that these you know monsters would have towards each other? And yeah, as looking closer at outsider status was a way of creating collective belonging and identifying as a catalyst for what found family would be. And this is important because found family is really like the crux, or the thing that like the plot shapes and hooks around, is changing what a monster is. And the overlap, with outsider and monsters in Stranger Things is nuanced. They're a type of outsider, even among those with outsider status already, like many of these groups in the 80s. So I feel like there's a definite connection and a drawing from that. So given the fact that they had outsider status, I was like, okay, well, what does belonging actually mean if we're looking into outsiders? And what does belonging mean for like monsters? So then I did a breakdown of Vecna and Elle and how they like both understood their power and understood their their relationship to them in the sense of being the word monsters, for instance. And these are things that I use as brainstorming in order to lock the script and anchor the ideas to then change and talk through to the writing team, so we can eventually get to different dramaturgically mapped interactions and the script. So there's a mechanic. Vecna is very internal grasping, for instance, where Elle is very external pushing, and that's the game mechanic, but it has a lot of symbolic, I think, resonance for how they engage with the world and how it feels to play them as monsters. There's element of how do they see themselves through others, where Vecna devours, intrudes, absorbs, and Elle is helpless, curious, loyal, and sort of reaching. However, it's important to say that monsterhood isn't only about belonging, alienation. It's also and how you are defined, but it's a choice. And that's one of the other patterns, Stranger Things. I think there's a theme that could be running through the show about monsterhood is what you choose, enabled or disabled by your group of others and the friends around you. Where Vecna sees the monster in Elle explicitly and calls to it, as we're going to see in a scene below. And Elle has killed an amount of people that's not really ever addressed in the show. And it's moments of this choice, when she beans Angela with the roller skate, where, Vecna and Elle can be most compared on this sort of spectrum. They're the only people alive who shared the same origins and trials under the same abuser. And Elle is the only person Henry sees as worthy of joining him as his own type of found family. So when she rejects him, it's a very powerful, statement and move for him, and a very powerful motivation. So this is actually behind the scenes of the script. I'm going to play this video. I wonder how to best do this. I'm going to read to you there are very few lines I kept from the show. And when I was looking back at it for this talk, I realized they were all lines that had the word monster in it, whether, intentionally or unintentionally. But they were the pivot points of kind of how the plot backbone is broken down. So right before, there's a major confrontation in season 4 where Elle kind of rejects Vecna's offer to join him after he's as this character that's an orderly done this crazy massacre, and his true nature is revealed. And the actual Jamie's actual monologue is she says, tricked you? No, I saved you. You are a prisoner here, just like me. To your papa, you are nothing more than an animal, a monster, a lab rat to be tamed. But in truth, 11, you're just the opposite. You're better than they are. Imagine what we could do together. We could reshape the world and remake it however we see fit. So I'm not going to, for time, and also just, I'm not going to show you that scene from the game, but I'm going to reference it. So in our game, there's actually some context where there's a point where Elle loses her power, as in the show, and she must relieve the traumatic memory she buried of Henry and Vecna by killing everyone in the lab she was raised in before she defeats him. An element for those scenes are represented as a memory labyrinth, where you must navigate long corridors and relive the same nursery scenes from the morning of the massacre. However, in the interactive dramaturgy, the memory is fickle, and each time you're revisiting the scenes, it's sort of changing a little bit, it's stuttering. She has to make her way through this labyrinth with both the voice of Dr. Brenner and the voice of Vecna kind of echoing in her head as kind of guides. And it's very interesting because Vecna's appealing to her to join him, but he also sees himself in her. He's recognizing the monster she is. He sees her capacity, which is I feel like there's an element that's interesting that I wanted to write more on, which is what is the capacity for monsterhood, and how like does that actually like communicate and be seen. And this in this excerpt that was removed. So this is from the actual script I wrote, and it's one of the few lines kept from the show. And this is a line that is counteracting Vecna's attempt to bring Elle into this collaboration, where Brenner, which is a monster in itself, another discussion, the line kept is, "You speak of monsters, superheroes, that's the stuff of myths and fairy tales. Reality truth is rarely so simple. People are not so easily defined. Only by facing all of ourselves, the good and the bad, can we become whole." And that is sort of the mantra that helps guide her through the labyrinth into this encounter. So as a counterpoint to this, this is from section 9 of the game, and it's from the actual recording script. And this is a scene I wrote between Max and Elle. And like so many monster patterns, that Elle rejects the hands of her creator and spurns that path. But what allows her to grow through this is essentially like the power of friendship, and that's relevant. It's like power friendship, woo, you know, in like this sort of like, you know, cinematic way. But it's relevant because it's more how it's tagged to the line of monster, how like a friend can help you understand and view yourself as a monster or not a monster. And the ability, there's an outsider element where Max's ability to actually cut against Elle and in the game have a turning point where she kind of like saves Elle as Elle attempts to save her by identifying her through this scene. And you can play the, I'm gonna play the audio.
Max! Remember when we first met? You were rude, duh. You were not a monster.
No. That time I saw you with Mike in the gym, I felt bad. I wanted to hurt you. I made you fall. I hurt you, Max.
Jealousy doesn't make you a monster. It means you feel things, Elle.
So I had most of my writing before this was like for comedy satires. So this was like a really interesting challenge. So I'm gonna just end here and not go into some of the outlines of the monster minds, because monster minds in our game are actually both programmatically in the code word and in the writing layouts of different worlds you can go into. And the script has like an example of like the dramaturgy, like a sort of layout and a graph of that, or sorry, the slideshow. I guess in conclusion, I'm speaking about like how I was able to find a way into this, despite like not having really written in this genre or done this type of work before. And the kind of takeaway for me was the circumstance don't make a monster, our choices in the circumstances do. And Elle has the strength of found family and bonds to connect and ground her. It's not to be, she's not to be isolated in the way that Henry Vecna was, which is the shade of difference in their monsterhood. And the friends that help her provide a mirror back to herself to understand her identity. Although it seems like a popcorn flick, there's actually some like deep character studies here and some like nuance that I, was honored to get to play around with and really inhabit. So you can see, I'm not really using my speaker notes, but you can see them in the slides if you're curious, and happy to answer any questions or talk about this process later. Thanks. This is the Monster Minds.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A before the coffee break. I'll ask speakers when they answer questions to restate the questions and run up to the mic very awkwardly. And thanks again to all the speakers for dealing with the power outage this morning for extremely visual talks. We're very appreciative. All right. Oh, we can also just move the mic to our people. Oh. Power is back, but we don't have a setup for projection right now, unfortunately. Very sad, but happy for all our future panelists who will be able to be downstairs. Questions from the audience for our panel? All right, let's start here. Why not? If you're feeling like it, we can move around. We just have to give it to the panelists.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. So I'm just thinking about a lot of things, right? I think that the real test of a good monster is just how much it haunts after the initial jump scare, right? So that there's something conceptual about the monster, right? It's not just the relentlessness of the monster or the kind of strange horror of its appearance, right? But it's how it returns to you unbidden, right? In those silent moments when you're, I don't know, taking a walk or in a dark room, how much the monster kind of returns to you. So my dissertation chair has has an essay where they're talking about, I don't know how many of you know Lisa Trevor in GameCube's remake of Resident Evil, right? So this is a child test subject that is a product of failed medical experiments, medical abuse. And so they talk about, my dissertation chair talks about how Lisa Trevor's body, as this kind of experimented upon body, connects with their own experience as an intersex person that had to go through all of these surgeries. And so identifying with the monster, right, in a kind of conceptual bodily level, I think that kind of connects with, your argument as well. Because I was thinking about the transgender body as the desired body. I think that there's been so much talk about, corporeality, like the body of the monster. But I'm thinking about, Samantha, like the consciousness of the monster, like, and also Mike, right? Like, how do we connect with the mind of the monster, not just like the body? Like, how do we connect with that? I don't know if that makes sense.
Someone want to take that?
So what I was presenting is a little bit was my way in to connect to the mind of the monster, and I also wanted to make it not like it was apologizing for him or humanizing him. That was important, but trying to make it in a day-to-day sort of way. So the way that I tried to do that is think about each scene and the sort of themes of like towards a trajectory of growth and what is that target, and then like break that down into the little moments where he himself is also haunted. I didn't talk about this, but there's a second larger monster behind that, and that larger monster kind of serves a role of exposition and almost to the audience in its way that helps draw out some of like his thoughts in a way that would be uncomfortable from a POV first-person game to just kind of talk as Vecna, right? Because he's not a chatty dude.
The term that came to my mind, Edmund, is hauntology, right? So this idea that certain kinds of textual traditions, certain kinds of gestural traditions, and so on are manifest in a moment of representation. So if what came to my mind pretty quickly as you were talking about through your question was something that I see quite often, but saw last night when we were playing a game, which is that there's a moment of embodiment that happens when someone finds at the table a voice, right? So it's somewhat in contrast to what Samantha was talking about, which is that in a tabletop game, because it's primarily verbal in general, when you find that voice, it really does add a lot of embodiment. And so having played as a player and having played as a game manager, so either I'm encountering the voice of the monster or I'm being the voice of the monster, that often insinuates a kind of embodiment and physical presence, though in addition, in tabletop role-playing games, the players also understand there's a set of rules. And there are rules that are in play at the moment that we're very aware of when one is encountering a monster. Different games have rules to kind of initiate that encounter. But we're also aware of all of these potential rules that exist in their absence but might be brought into play. in both of those cases, vocalization suggesting an embodiment, and rules either in operation or potentially in operation are suggesting a kind of physicality, a kind of possible impact that can happen as you continue to encounter the monster, either through dialogue and verbal interaction or through the work of rolling dice, making choices about attacks and defense and that sort of thing. I hope, I think we're towards your question. Cool.
Any other questions?
Thank you, everyone, for a really wonderful panel in dealing with the technological issues. So it was really wonderful. I have a particular question for Mike. I'm really animated by your presentation, and I wonder if as you're exploring like this tension between the traditional third-person perspective and the transition to maybe thinking through and about what happens when you're playing Monster from a first-person perspective, what you would say, or if you have a comment on sort of, I don't know, what I might call an interstitial stage where you have like, there are so many narratives now that still have like that third person point of view, but you like hear the internal monologue. They're from there's still the monster's story. So Warm Bodies would be like a classic. I mean, there are so many examples, right? Like that whole film is shot in the third person, or most of it, but you hear his internal monologue throughout, and you're supposed to identify with him as a zombie. And I know there are so many examples along those lines. And a second question along those lines, when you're talking about D&D and playing monsters in particular, and about how even if there's the game itself has a defined monster, the half-orc or whatever, but there are I wonder about the definition of monster in that context, because you can play as a chaotic evil character. I mean, you can turn any character you want into a monster and play as a monster, even if it's not even if the game doesn't see it as a monster. I don't know. So your presentation raised a lot of those really interesting questions. So thank you for that.
I'll try not to digress about hold person versus hold monster in D&D and let Mike take it away.
Thank you for the question, and I'm looking forward to a question for Chris and Elliot for sure. I think you've raised a bunch of little complications and wrinkles in this. One of the things that came to my mind was one of the things that Michael Chambers and I write about in Systemic Dramaturgy is the dramaturgy that happens at the table. Everybody at the table is doing the kinds of analytic and creative process to think about character, to co-create the world, to sustain the world, to sustain the characters of others. And what that means is that you're everybody at the table is simultaneously an audience member spectating the other players, spectating imaginatively what is being co-constructed, and then you're also performing in the first person. So there's something integral to the tabletop role-playing game. I think I can state this almost, well, what does it mean almost categorically? Almost categorically. That you're always oscillating between first person and third person in tabletop role-playing games, or in a lot of them, most of them maybe. The other thing that came to my mind as you were talking is the idea of a kind of sort of an overlapping idea of embodiment. So there's embodiment, there's action, there's embodiment, there's playing with the rules, but there's also a lot of, and this is something I'm thinking about for this interview I'm doing later in the week, which is the idea of intertextuality. And so many tabletop role-playing games are so deeply enmeshed in other genres and textual connections. You spoke to 3 of those in your game. And so there's a way in which you have this kind of modal, kind of modal or prefab understanding of yourself as a first person because you've been watching all of these other games or reading these texts and so on. So those would be maybe 2 ways of thinking about that first person, third person oscillation.
Great. And we are at the end of our time, but I want to strongly encourage folks to play Chris and Elliot's projects right after the coffee break. They're just out the breezeway in 306. And if you don't have a chance to sit down with Elliot's digital piece for a long period of time, I believe that's available on itch.io these days. So keep an eye out for those if you need some more private time with that project. All right, thank you so much for dealing with this power outage. I'm glad we have power back, and hopefully the winds die down. Welcome to climate change. All right, bye everybody.